Hello, Lucas. Can you? I can't hear you, Lucas.
Oh wait, that's because I'm muted. That's probably why. Hello.
Hello. Good. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you. Just going to find stuff on my phone. This is the first talk from the new house, actually. So I had to get my bearings a bit again. That's all right.
Hello.
Oh, I recognize that wallpaper, Angus.
Spotlight myself, everyone. How's Greece, man? Oh, I don't know. We're live on YouTube, so maybe don't give away too much identifying information. But it's good. Tell me it's good.
It's lovely, lovely and warm and lovely. More family news to come when we're just the family. Is this? Are you in your new bedroom there? Is this? Are we seeing?
Actually, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I can
wonderful.
From freely.
We were just saying with Nita, we need to listen to this talk because if I remember rightly, Haiti were the first ones to congratulate the Greeks on their revolution, right?
That's exactly right. Yes.
Okay.
First nation to recognize Greece as an independent country was Haiti, and we're about to see why. I did a lot of. Well, I'll talk about this next time. This is just more background. But they did a lot of sponsoring other revolutions in other countries because they knew how hard it had been for them, basically, and they wanted to help out others.
Right. Okay.
It might just be us this time because it's an off week and everything's weird, but things are opening up as well. But that's fine.
And it's everybody's opening up, etc. We may want to have a summer break.
I might. I've considered that
at some stage. Anyway, yeah. See what you think. But anyway, I'm looking forward to today.
I'm still happy with. I think this talk should be an interesting one, and that's the main metric by whether or not I think I should do the talks or not. Whether I think I would get anything out of them. Hopefully, other people do as well. But, it's essentially secondary. Let's just check.
Absolutely.
On YouTube. Yes, that's what you're watching on YouTube, so that's always good.
I'm going to switch off my camera because the Wi-Fi is not great.
That's all right. Just going to admit from YouTube, from Zoom. Yeah, there are people watching, so it's all good. I'm vindicated, and the screen is still up. My phone. I'm just going to do a little test comment. And hello to everyone on YouTube. I'm going to stream at a slightly different time to normal, but anyone who's on my mailing list will know why. That seems to have gone through. Lovely. And I hope you're doing well. I can hear someone enjoying a nice cold drink or something in the background.
Yes. Yes.
Well deserved, I'm sure. No shame. That's
very hot.
I might have a beer afterwards. Actually, it was really miserable earlier here in London, but it's gone sunnier now, which is nice.
Good.
I'm glad that it's warm enough to have a nice cold drink where you are.
And we've just had the lovely fish as well, really fresh fish for supper. So all is good. It's good.
Actually, we're 1 minute away, so I'm going to share my screen and mute everyone. But I'm glad that people are doing well and are feeling good, and it's getting a bit less depressing even life now, which is incredible.
Yes.
So that's
we all agree with that one.
You've seen us through the lockdown, Lucas. Thanks to you, it was bearable.
It's been my absolute pleasure. And in fact, the time is I have it different on different clocks. I've got 1 minute left on my phone, but on my it's 7:30. Oh, I'll give it an extra minute, see if anyone else is trickling. I've actually got decent viewership, so I feel good. So welcome to everyone who's just coming in. You haven't missed anything, don't worry. This is the first part of what's going to be a two-part series on the Haitian Revolution, a little interlude because I find it really interesting. So I'm just going to mute everyone. But welcome everyone to this talk. So, the Haitian Revolution, and we're going to try and answer the question today, why did the Haitian Revolution happen? And there's two parts to that question. The first part is why did the Haitian Revolution happen? And the second part is why didn't a similar revolution happen in other places in the world? And we're going to try and answer both those questions. But so there'll be a kind of background to the history and why it happened, and then talk about what the triggers went on, and then finish off with, yes, as I said, why Haiti and why not other colonies. And the picture I have here is the royal crest of Haiti, I think from when it was an empire for a period of time, though it might still be the crest to this day. And I like to think of this crest as, you know, those brightly colored rainforest frogs that have very bright green and red and orange to show they're really poisonous and no other creature should eat them. Similar things are going on with this crest. It's very brightly colored, and if you look at it, it's an island, which Haiti is, covered in spears and guns and cannons and axes, all with the same message of go away, leave us alone, we are independent. So union through force, I think is what the slogan is. Though you can correct me on my French if I'm wrong, which symbolizes to some extent the Haitian Revolution itself. So let's talk about this island. Saint-Domingue in French, Santo-Domingo in Spanish, because this island was discovered in Christopher Columbus's second voyage in, I want to say, 1495. And in fact, Christopher Columbus made his first voyage in 1492 across the ocean blue, across the Atlantic, and found all these islands. He never actually set foot on the mainland of the Americas, but he found islands like Cuba and like Santo-Domingue, and immediately started founding one of the first colonies the Spanish ever had in the New World was on this island. And they set about basically enslaving the local population and trying to mine what precious metals there were, which isn't very many on this island. So it was mostly a mining operation. And after a few decades, two resources ran out. First of all, almost all of the local native population were killed through the terrible conditions they were in. And secondly, the precious metals were exhausted. And the island became a bit of a colonial backwater, effectively. Lots of pirates lived there. This is by the 1720s. This is basically a backwater. There's mostly pirates living there. But by in the 1730s, the French took control of it and began to colonize it in earnest. And it was basically one of the last colonies in the entire Spanish Main. Every other scrap of rock jutting out of the Atlantic Ocean had been claimed by either the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the British, or the Dutch. And Saint-Domingue, originally called Haiti by the Taino people who had lived there before Columbus ever came there. That's why it's called Haiti to this day. Saint-Domingue was one of the last colonies created. But very, very quickly, it became extremely lucrative through the plantation economy. First, initially, the planters were producing tobacco, but soon they found that they were completely tobacco. Basically, anyone can make a tobacco plantation if they need to. It doesn't take very much skill, but all it needs is quite good soil. But very quickly, other colonies on the Americas, particularly 13 colonies, which would be British America, which we've heard of from other talks, would take off in tobacco and they wouldn't really be able to compete. Other resources, indigo, which is used in the production of dyeing clothes. But eventually the two main ones were coffee and sugar. They both require quite a lot of startup capital. There's a lot of very expensive and complicated machinery and technology that's needed to plant sugar on a large scale. But by the 1740s, so like decades later, Haiti, Saint-Domingue became the single biggest supplier of the world's sugar alongside Jamaica, and produced half the coffee in the world that was being consumed. So the plantation economy began this massive boom. 600 ships a year went from Saint-Domingue to Bordeaux in France, ferrying back and forth trade goods. And I say to Bordeaux specifically because the law was, as was the case in British America, there are parallels to be drawn here. The law was that Saint-Domingue could only trade with France. It could only import goods from France and could only export their sugar, their coffee, their indigo back to France, which a lot of the rich people were quite unhappy with because they rightly suspected that they could get quite a lot better prices if they traded on the open market. So there was quite a lot of smuggling and black market trading happening. But very quickly, by the middle of the 18th century, the French colony became extremely lucrative and was basically one of the most lucrative colonies, if not the most, in the New World. Huge amounts of money were just flooding backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, all through Saint-Domingue. And the driving force of this plantation economy was slave trade. What we have here is the sugarcane, which is the main crop, cash crop. And thousands and thousands of slaves, black Africans, were brought across the Atlantic from Africa into the New World. For example, in 1787 alone, in a single year, France transported 20,000 slaves from Africa just into Saint-Domingue. You can compare that with Britain in the same year, 38,000 slaves for all their colonies in the entire New World. So Saint-Domingue just gobbled up slaves, and the death rate was astonishingly high. I've seen various different sources. Some have it as 50% of the enslaved people die within the first year of arrival. Other people I've seen saying that the average life expectancy was 3 years if you're brought from Africa to Saint-Domingue. And there are various reasons for this. First of all, disease. Malaria and yellow fever cause an extraordinarily high death rate. Particularly amongst the white population, they die of disease all the time. Basically, if you're born and if you survived a couple of generations in Saint-Domingue, then that means that there's some degree of genetic resistance and immunity to disease. But people who come to this island for the first time, a very large proportion of them die of tropical diseases, yellow fever, malaria, dengue, stuff like that. That's one side of it. And you can tell how one example of how high the death rate is, and I'll talk about the reasons for it in a second, is that, for example, most of the slaves were men, and the women, the female slaves, would have comparatively better jobs. They would be in the house rather than the field, to use that description. So they'd be doing administrative stuff, looking after the household of the planter, rather than out in the field working on the sugarcane. Not always, but often this would be the case. And so in many slave communities in Saint-Domingue, polyandry was legal, which is very rare. There are very few populations, very few examples of this happening in human history. Normally, you get a lot of polygamy, which means one man has multiple wives. That happens a lot. But polyandry, where one woman has multiple husbands, is very rare, but it happens here because the understanding is that men die so fast that women have multiple husbands just, otherwise there's no point in marrying someone and having them being monogamous if they're going to die that quickly. But the other side of it is that slaves had, for a long period of time, effectively no legal rights. So the work was extremely dangerous. Sugarcane is very sharp, and as you're working, cutting it, you're getting scratched constantly by the barbs of the plant. And the refining process of sugarcane, it gets you have to feed it into these massive rollers that crush it down and extract out the syrup. And basically, if any part of your hand gets caught in the rollers, your entire arm gets sucked in. So people walking around with only one arm was extremely common. And there's boiling sugar with very poor health and safety standards, so people will get burned all the time. That's one side. It's an extremely difficult, dangerous, complicated task where you're working 6 days a week, sun up till sundown, so you're exhausted most of the time. And the other half of it is the punishments, where effectively the overseers, the managers, could punish you for whatever, any perceived slight, as much as they wanted. They had the power of life or death over slaves, most commonly through whipping, and people would be whipped to death. It wasn't uncommon at all. And Yeah, effectively, I would make the claim that being a slave in Saint-Domingue in the 18th century, for this period of history, this is probably the worst place to live on Earth, to be an enslaved person in Saint-Domingue. You're working 6 days a week. Your seventh day where you don't have to work. Instead, you have to work where you're planting on your own little crop of land that you'll be given. And you'll grow your own food rather than being given food by your masters. So you have to work or you'll starve. And so it's just constant, never-ending work with very, very little time off, effectively. The only way that you could get time off would be petit marronage, which is where you basically run away for a short period of time and then come back and would be punished for it. But it was the only way to avoid the crushing work. And it was the view of the overseers, the managers, and the plantation owners, which are the different levels of hierarchy and organization in Saint-Domingue. It was their view that because they knew the slaves would die so quickly, by the late 18th century, there's about 5% per year die off, to ship in more people constantly to replace the numbers. There's no point in trying to make them last for an entire lifespan. It's not like in North America, where the expectation is that you don't really need to bring in more people because the people will reproduce and naturally create their own slave population. Because you know they'll die off, you just try and work them to death as quickly as possible and then move on. The price of people, because people are property here, so slavery, is very, very low compared to the price of sugar and the sugar that's being brought out of the continent, of the island. So it's very, very bad. In 1685, there was, for all the French colonies, there was published this thing called the Code Noir, the Black Code, which tried to regulate the violence and tried to restrain what could be done to the slaves. And in fact, even meant that officially slaves could complain about poor treatment to the government. As you can expect, this code was completely ignored. There were cases where slaves even tried to complain about the treatment, and basically they were just completely ignored, effectively. And so, yeah, life is very, very, very bad for the slaves. And the slaves make up almost everyone that lives on this island. I'm going to talk you through the demographic divisions here. There's 4 types of person, effectively, living in Saint-Domingue. There are the 2 kinds of white populations and the 2 kinds of non-white populations, pure African black or mixed race. On the white side, there's the gros blanc, the big whites, and the petit blanc, the small whites. The big whites are almost always born in France, and they are the plantation owners, the managers. They're the super, super rich people. They're the big shot lawyers, the colonial officials, the government, the captains of the militia, Governor General. And they have almost all the wealth. And they basically tried to spend as little time as possible in Saint-Domingue, in the cities, because it was incredibly hot. For them, incredibly boring. There's only a few, gambling dens or brothels to amuse them. And there's a lot of disease, and you die if you spend too much time there. So they were almost about half of the plantations in the entire colony were owned by absentee owners who would just spend all their time in France instead, only very, very reluctantly coming back to Saint-Domingue to some kind of major crisis that needs direct oversight. And they have all the political power, effectively, in the Ancien Regime. So this is still, feudal France with a king at this point. Stay tuned. Then there's the Petit Blanc, the small whites. And they are often born in France, but sometimes also born in Saint-Domingue. And they are the poorer lawyers, the shopkeepers, the merchants, the plantation managers rather than owners, the ones who manage the plantations. And they have less political power, but they're still free. They can do whatever they want. Then there's the free colored population. And they are, there's this really, really complicated thing of mixed race where I think there's technically 128 different designations of what it can be to be free colored, ranging all the way from having like 128th black and all your other ancestors are white, all the way down to fully 100% African black. And there are all these different complicated laws that were mostly ignored that governed how you could be treated and what kind of rights you had that I won't bore you with. But they were collectively the free colored populations. And for a lot of Haitian of history of the colony, they were effectively equal with the Petit Blanc. There weren't a lot of laws that changed how they're governed, but in 1758, we start seeing a racial caste system appears that targets them and makes them carry licenses to prove that they aren't slaves. There's sumptuary laws, so that bans them from wearing certain clothes. They can't hold public offices, that kind of stuff. And then basically everyone else on the colony, like 90% of the people that live on this colony, are the slaves. And so we're talking, let's say, from the dawn of the revolution, 40,000 white people split between the big whites and the small whites, 28,000 or so free colored people, and then 452,000 slaves. So it's this vast majority of the population of the slaves. And they also have their own divisions. There are, for example, this house slave and field slave division, where the house slaves would be household management of the plantations, the big houses, or doing administrative jobs, or working as coachmen, that kind of stuff. And then there's the field slaves, but there's also there's another way of dividing up the Black African population would be between the people who are the general working in the fields and then the overseers. And the overseers would be like the ones whipping the slaves and they're being punished. They tended to be Black Africans. But as well as handing out punishment, they also tended to be the leaders, the community leaders of the slaves. And they had a bit more privilege within the system, but also within the slave networks. And a lot of the people who will end up being in charge of Haiti, the rulers in time, spoiler alert, will themselves have originally been overseers in their lives. That's another way of dividing up the slave population. And yes, another way is between those who were born in Africa and those who were born in Haiti, born in Saint-Domingue. And that's another division, which is important because people will be brought in from Africa all the time. And imagine it the other way around, to give you an extent of how different it was. Imagine if Africa had ended up colonizing Europe and you're brought to this island where there are Africans in charge, and suddenly everyone else around you, there are Germans, Italians, Spanish people, Poles, Portuguese people, and a few Brits. And you have no idea what the hell's going on. Very few people speak the same language as you. They all follow different religions. They look different to you. It's very, very confusing. That's what the experience was for the Africans coming immediately fresh from Africa into Saint-Domingue. You had a mixture. The Yoruba people, who are from modern-day Nigeria, the Fon, who are from modern-day Benin, the Congo people, who are from modern-day Angola and the modern-day country of Congo. This whole mixture of people who would eventually, over generations, the people who were born in Saint-Domingue would come to speak the same language, this Creole mixture of French and all the different African languages. They would come to follow the same religion as well, Voodoo, which is this unifying religion that's this mishmash of Catholicism and all the other African religions from West Africa, from where these people were coming across the Atlantic, all blended together. And so there were saints and priests, and Voodoo was this really important religion because it effectively rejects slavery. That's one important thing. And the second thing is there's this underlying belief that if you die, your spirit goes back to Africa, which will come important later. And again, a lot of the rebel leaders were like overseers, but also Voodoo priests. That was an important part of their culture as well. So yeah, in terms of who holds the power, there are actually three answers to this question. There's the big whites, because the Gros Blanc, they own all the land and they have all the official colonial offices. So they hold the power. But also the small whites and the free coloreds, who have very similar positions in society, they actually run the place, right? They do all the administration and make up a lot of the the militia, for example. So they also hold a lot of power. But also, it's all the enslaved people who do all the actual work. Without them, Saint-Domingue is just a very hot place with lots of disease. The reason why it's so profitable is that there are hundreds of thousands of Black Africans working day and night, every day of the week, to produce this liquid gold and then later powdered gold of sugar to be exported back across to France. So, as we'll see later again, the slaves, both by virtue of there being so many of them, and by virtue of the fact that they actually do all the real work on this island, they have quite a lot of power themselves, though for decades this power is not realized as they are enslaved. It will become important later. And there are webs of tension. And there are, again, all these different ways that you can divide Haiti up between rich and poor, between white and non-white, and between slave and free. Essentially, everyone hates everyone else. The poor whites hate the rich whites for underpaying them because, you know, those rich bastards own the place and they pay us scraps while they cart off all the money. Meanwhile, the rich whites despise the poor whites, A, for being poor, but B, because the poor whites, the ones who are running the place, you know, are constantly skimming off the top and stealing from them all the time. And the French-born people look down on the people born in Saint-Domingue as being, you know, these yokels, these inbred whatever. And the coloured population hate the white people for being racist. White people hate the black people and all the non-white people because they are racist. The coloured people despise the slaves. That's an important point. You know, a lot of the coloured people, free coloured population, own slaves themselves and are very happy for that system to continue, and were themselves despised by the whites. And all free people, even pure black free people, brutalize the slaves at every opportunity because it shows that there's someone below you that you can like exert authority over. And obviously the slaves despise everyone else because, you know, they're treating them terribly. As Paul Fregosi, the historian, puts it, Haiti was hell, but Haiti was rich. Effectively, it's kind of miserable to be almost anyone living on this entire continent, colony, except for that one fact that for a lot of people, they were making a huge amount of money. And there's also one extra group of people that I have neglected to mention thus far, who are the Maroons. I mentioned the petit marronage, which is where people, it's quite a common practice, enslaved people would run away from their masters for a short period of time and then come back to live with them and come back to slavery. Often there'd be like a negotiation. They say, if you give me better conditions, I'll come back. Well, other people would run away permanently and they'll be small, so they're not a very significant population at all, hundreds to thousands of them, compared to the thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of all these other populations. But the Maroon communities would live mixed with what remained of the indigenous population and live up in the mountains in the middle of the island, not down on the coast where it's big and flat and there's plantations everywhere. And they had their own community. And again, they basically hated everyone else, and they would raid down and steal from every other population and take what they needed to survive. So the colony is a powder keg, effectively, with this system of brutal, horrific violence, this system of, again, similar to the American colonies, there's this ramping up of racism rather than what you might think of, it used to be bad in the past and then things slowly got better and better and better. And now racism is better, obviously not solved. Ignore the, you know, whatever anyone says, racism is not solved, right? But it's not the case that it's constantly gotten better. There's been rampings up and rampings down. And there was this ramping up going on. And there's all that tension. But then the final web of tension is that things are happening in France. Strange things are happening in France. And throughout this entire period, and we'll get into the main body of the revolution next week, is that there's this big time delay. It takes 5 weeks for any information to travel from France to Saint-Domingue, and it'll take another 5 weeks to travel back again. That's assuming no interim time at all. So it's months before any information can travel to and then back across the Atlantic. But in 1789, things start happening in France, and any long-time listeners to Mostly Harmless History will remember that the French Revolution is going down at this period, basically, and a lot of crazy things. I didn't go into too much detail because it was so complicated, but a lot of really crazy, really complicated things are happening in France. The most important, for our purposes now, 1789, the National Assembly of what has just become the French Republic publishes the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And a very important part of it is the all men are free and equal part of it. What the hell does this mean for Saint-Domingue? Does it apply to women? Does it apply to slaves? Does it apply to citizens of the colonies? Does it apply to non-white Frenchmen? Well, who knows? No one, including the National Assembly, really knows when they first publish it. Who does this revolution represent in Saint-Domingue? Well, the delegation is sent from Saint-Domingue, from the big whites and also the free coloreds, both send representations, delegates, back to France to try and make their claims in the National Assembly. And effectively, the free coloreds kind of win because they are able to shame the National Assembly, who are making all these liberal proclamations and declarations. Oh, we're abolishing, the feudal system, we're abolishing the nobility, we're abolishing feudal dues and taxes, and we're going to free the peasants and that kind of stuff. They're able to shame them into giving the free coloreds their rights back, and to expand this proclamation and Declaration of Rights of Man, free and equal, to expand that to the free, not slave population of Saint-Domingue. Now, it is possible that the liberals of the French Revolution really thought in their hearts of hearts that the system of slavery is probably wrong as well, right? Like, it's probably bad. However, those of you who know anything about the French Revolution and who may remember it from previous talks and stuff will remember that the reason why it happened is because the French government ran out of money, right? The French government was in a desperate financial squeeze, and one of their only remaining sources of huge amounts of cash was the Saint-Domingue colony. It was absolutely lucrative, so they just couldn't. They kind of betrayed their high-minded rhetoric by realizing that they couldn't afford to abolish slavery, because they knew that if they lost the profits from Saint-Domingue, then they would be really, really, really screwed. So they didn't really want to abolish slavery just yet, let's say, but things would change later. However, as soon as the Declaration of the Rights of Man is propagated out in the French colonies, just violence explodes everywhere. First of all, the white population is furious. This is in 1791, after like literally years of debates and negotiation and discussion. In 1791, the lid blows off the powder keg, and 3 revolts start at the same time. First of all, the white planters refuse to let the free colored people be recognized as citizens. So they go into open revolt in a very American Revolution style, where they want independence from the metropole, the home country, in order to gain more control over their own colony. That's the first revolt. Secondly, the free coloreds go into revolt, demanding their rights that have been given to them by France. So they go into revolt against the big whites, and that's a fight that happens there. But the third revolt is the most important one, because the enslaved peoples of Saint-Domingue have been talking to each other, and they realize 2 things. Well, they think 2 things. One, our masters are fighting each other. They know this. There's a lot more than you might expect. There's a lot more information and discussion that happens among the slave communities. So they realize our masters are fighting each other. And 2, a rumor begins to go around these slave communities that the king has abolished slavery. And those bastards in Saint-Domingue aren't telling anyone, because they don't want slavery to be abolished. This is founded in some basis of truth because of the Code Noir not being recognized in Saint-Domingue, but it didn't actually happen. But what does happen is that on the 14th of August in Bois Caiman, I think is how you pronounce it, 2 people, Dutty Bookman and Cecile Fatiman, who are themselves black slave overseers, in a semi-secret meeting, signal they slaughter a black pig. They're Vaudin priests. They slaughter a pig, and they will ritually drink its blood. These various local leaders of the slave communities in Saint-Domingue meet in secret on the 14th of August, kill a pig in a Vaudin ritual and drink its blood, and they basically swear themselves to liberty or death. And this is really important, because we've talked about a few revolutions in the time that anyone who's been watching my talk for a period, we've talked about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, all these different ones. And there's all this rhetoric of people saying, oh, the British, for example, the American revolutionaries say the British want to make slaves of us. Or in 1848, the Hungarians say we'll be slaves no more from the Austrian Empire. All these people are saying this rhetoric, but really what they're arguing against is a slight tax hike. these people, when they drink that blood and make this declaration, they are actually fighting against slavery and the worst kind of slavery that it's possible to have. And they go into revolt, and within weeks, 100,000 slaves tear the northern part of the colony to pieces. 4,000 white people are killed. 180 sugar plantations and hundreds of other ones are burnt to the ground or destroyed. And fighting continues. But the white people are trying to fight back. But these people believe from their voting religion that if you die, you go back to Africa. That's not such a bad fate compared to surrendering. And so the island begins to tear itself apart. And I recognize that we're running out of time. But just to answer really quickly, why Saint-Domingue and not other colonies? As you can see, I've got a little GIF here. There's all these different places, colonies from Spain, Britain, Netherlands, France, and Denmark, and Portugal, but that's further south. Why it is that it's in Haiti specifically, it's because of, I'd say, two main answers and a kind of sneaky third answer. The two main answers are that the population in Saint-Domingue was so big that it was like 9/10 the population of the island. And they've all got machetes because that's the tool, the big knife that you use to harvest the sugar, right? So that's one reason. Another one is the French Revolution, and the fact that there's massive social upheavals at home means that they can interpret it in different ways and try to gain their rights off in the colony. And the final answer is that, well, there were slave revolts in Jamaica, in Cuba, in other places. There's all kinds of different massive revolts and rebellions and revolutions that happen all over the place throughout this period. So that's partly why Saint-Domingue happens. But in conclusion, there are a whole bunch of different factors that cause the revolution in Haiti. This web of tension, the French Revolution, the intolerable position of slavery, all that kind of stuff. And it is unclear from the beginning whether it would be the big whites breaking free from France and ruling France like ruling Saint-Domingue like the 13 colonies became the United States of America, or if the free coloreds would create a republic, or if the slaves would rise up and make themselves free. But next week, we're going to discuss that. And next week, we're going to talk about the revolution in its full form. But for now, I'd like to ask if anyone has any questions about the background, the lead up, and the history of Saint-Domingue that we've covered so far. And there's a question or two coming in immediately. I'm just going to be monitoring the YouTube chat as well, see if anyone else has any question. And yes, so were there any notable leaders of the revolution amongst the enslaved people, and did they orchestrate it? So those two guys I mentioned before, Bookman and Fatima, they were slaves. And they were the ones who were rising up. And there are a few others. I can't remember the names at the top of my head, actually, but there was another formerly enslaved guy who rose up in this first revolt wave. And he was famous for being very, very violent. Because as this wave of slave revolt spread across the island, there was the discussion of what do you do to the plantations, what do you do to how do you treat the other enslaved people, and what do you do with the like white people that you come across. And there's a whole mix. So say, for example, if you're a slave and you don't really want to get involved in the revolt because either you're living a decent life as a coachman or something, you aren't working out in the field, so you don't want to risk your position by getting involved in a revolt, or you think it's doomed and everyone's going to be executed, so you don't want to risk it, or whatever other reason. Would they be left alone? And how would you treat the white people you come across? So some rulers would be like one of these enslaved leaders of the revolution would be super, super violent and would kill any white person he found, would kill any black person who didn't join the revolution, would, destroy the systems of oppression of the plantation. So yeah, there's a lot of different variety, but yeah, there are a lot of rulers amongst the enslaved people. But the most famous one, who, if you've heard of any leaders to do with the Haitian Revolution, the most famous one was Toussaint Louverture, known as also the Black Napoleon or the Father of Haiti or Black Spartacus, has a whole bunch of different names. And there were other people, we're going to talk about it next week, basically, the other main leaders, but the most famous one is Toussaint Louverture, who was like the guy that took Haiti from what was possibly going to be a like free colored republic and made it a black supremacist, eventually empire. Like hugely important guy. So eventually there's various ways where it looks like the big whites will make Haiti like a free place from France, and then the free colors, and eventually it's the black slaves who come to rule the place. That's kind of a complicated answer, sorry. How did the enslaved black people have the sufficient weaponry to overthrow the whites and colors? That's a really good question. The key is that there's a combination of reasons. First of all, the main tool of the plantation for the sugar king was the machete. And the machete is basically a really big knife. It's not as good as a gun, but when there's like 400,000 of you and you don't care if you die, it's a pretty decent weapon. And that's the first part. That's how the revolt initially spread, is by people just taking machetes to their masters. That's one side. The other side is that some of the more privileged slaves had guns, either to go hunting in their own time or even to keep the less privileged slaves in line, which is maybe it seems weird, but it's possible. You know, if you were an overseer, you might be given a gun and they were able to use those. But the second part is that as the slave revolt spread and they took towns and overthrew plantations, they were able to take weapons from the white population and then use those. So they started out with basically like everyone had a massive knife, which isn't great, but it's something. And then as the revolution spread, they were able to get, and you can see from the background what's going to happen further on. Eventually, we're going to see former slaves in uniform with guns, trained like armies, fighting properly. That eventually starts to happen. But in the early stages, this wave of initially using the machetes and then stealing weapons wherever possible, and then using those to let you steal more, and then it spreads, and eventually half the colony's in flames. Yeah. Second question is: were women as violent as the men when the killing spree started? I couldn't tell you exactly. I don't know for sure. It would surprise me if they weren't as violent as the men, if that makes sense. And there's something. I have to check my notes again, but I'm pretty sure there was a thing that happened where the free colours. So it's not exactly the same as the slave revolt, but one of the major triggers to the free coloured revolt was a large group of women going into the colonial offices and demanding their rights under the Declaration of the Rights of Man. So certainly the women were very much involved in the like revolutions that are about to happen to Haiti. But it is worth mentioning that for the enslaved population, like the vast majority of men, it's like, I don't know, 70-80% male for this enslaved population. So there just weren't as many women to be doing stuff. Another question is: how do you explain free black people being violent to slaves? That is a really good question. And I've kind of hinted at this in previous talks. And I personally, it's so alien to like our perception now. And there's kind of I suppose there's two answers to this question. One answer, and this is the one I hinted at previously, is that it is really hard for modern people to understand how pervasive and how powerful the institution of slavery was, right? So it's really hard to grasp how much, to the extent that when the USA sets up a region of Africa for former slaves to go to and live in Africa. That's what Liberia is. The modern day country began as a project where black people in America can go back to Africa and live as free people. They started enslaving Africans because it's so ingrained in culture that there are two types of people: free and enslaved. And the enslaved person is culturally dead. They're almost dead. They're property. They're not human, right? That's what the culture believed. And that's crazy to us because obviously we as modern people know, obviously they are people and they have their own agency and their own dreams and desires, and they can feel pain and all that kind of thing. But the really hyper dominant culture was that the enslaved person isn't a person. They're less than human. And that's part of the reason why, when you are free, you would treat the slaves terribly, because it's to demonstrate that you aren't a slave, right? It's the same way. That's how the Native Americans tried to demonstrate to the U.S. government that they should be treated like civilized people. Is that they started practicing slavery. It's crazy to us. I still can't really. I understand it in theory and concept, but I can't really grasp it myself. That is the way that you demonstrate your humanity, is by treating other people like less than humans. But that seems to be the phenomenon. On the other side of it is the racial aspect, right? How can we explain? Wouldn't there be more solidarity between black people who are free and black people who are enslaved? And again, you'd think there would be, but in this period, we are seeing for the first time, and again, this is really hard because it's almost the other way around. This is a precept that we have in the modern day that they didn't back then, and that's the idea of race as something that is really, really real. You start to get in actually like the 19th century, so we're a few decades away from this. And yes, there are, so as I said, in 1758, the start of like these this strict racial caste system of sumptuary laws and blocking non-white people from various offices, that kind of thing. But that's not the same as there being an understanding that necessarily that white people should all stick together and non-white people should all stick together. The society of Saint-Domingue throughout the 18th century was fairly, for those people who are free, for not those who are enslaved, it was fairly egalitarian in that sense. And it's the laws being imposed by the French metropole, and they were making these laws for a reason. They wanted to drive a wedge between the free colored population and the free white population, so that they couldn't unite together and realize that they had very similar economic circumstances, and then fight for independence against France. So it's this top-down thing of racism, if that makes sense. And I know I've spent this entire time talking about the racial hatred that existed between everyone else, but there wasn't really an understanding that this is really complicated and really hard to explain. There wasn't really necessarily an understanding that you were like someone else just because you had the same skin color as them, right? And often free colored people would have lighter skin than white people. If you're what was called, for example, an octoroon, which means that you have out of your great grandparents, one of them is African, then you are technically a free color person. You might be incredibly pasty and white if you live indoors, and a white person who has lived and worked in the fields as a plantation manager their entire life would be really, really tanned, and therefore would have a lot darker skin than you, but they're a white and you're a colored, right? Which shows the absurdity of the system. And so there's like, on some sense there was racial hatred, but in another sense there was a hatred of like different cultures, different categories of cultures, of you're part of the colored culture and you're part of the white culture. And even though your skin is whiter, even though your skin could be lighter or darker than someone of a different culture, that's not the point, right? So I hope that makes some kind of sense. That racism was different, maybe not real, but it was at least different in the 18th century to what it was in the 19th. And the kind of racism that becomes a thing in the 19th century is the kind that still exists in the world to this day. Yeah, so I don't know, it's kind of confused, but I hope that makes some kind of sense to explain how free black people can treat enslaved black people really, really badly. And that will be the case throughout the whole period of the Haitian Revolution, is that free black people will treat enslaved black people very, very poorly. Not always, but a lot of the time. That is a consistent phenomenon. And it seems really crazy, and I don't fully understand it, but I see that it did happen. And that's my attempt to give some kind of examples and reasons for why it did happen. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions at all? I see that we're almost out of time, so as we usually do. Thank you very much. Whoever sent a nice comment on YouTube, that's very kind of you. But does anyone else have any other questions or comments at all? No stupid questions at all. If there's anything that you're wondering about or trying to like work out in your head, then you can ask it at all. You won't be silly. But if not, our next talk will be. Is that a question? Sorry. Yeah. our next talk will be in a week's time, 1 week's time, next week, where we'll get back to the usual schedule of talks, and it'll be discussing the second part, the actual Haitian Revolution itself. We've got right to the tip of violence breaks out, and suddenly the social order's being upturned, and the black slaves are fighting for their freedom, and it's all exciting. And we're going to see what happens and what that means for the continent, for the colony, for the world. And we'll pick up next week for that one. So 7 days away. But thank you very much, everyone, for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Cheers, guys.
Thank you, Lucas. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lucas. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Lucas.